I don't want to cut into too much of Irwin's time here. We're already 7 minutes past 12, so I think we can probably begin this process and take a little bit of time with introduction. But I think let's get going. I'm always impressed by the attendance at Talks at 12. It's just amazing. And the diversity of people and the fact that I see the same faces and I see different faces also. So I'm glad we're reaching as a center a very wide audience. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Nuno, and I'm one of the senior staff here. I'd like to introduce Irwin Epstein. Irwin comes to us from Hunter College, the Silberman School of Social Work. He is, well, I love the term here. He occupies the Helen Rear Chair of Applied Social Work Research. He didn't bring the chair with him, but we did supply a chair for him. Most of you know that Hunter is part of the City University of New York, and most of what Irwin does is teaches in the doctoral program. I had the very fortunate experience of having him as one of my professors in my doctoral program with Hunter. So without much further, I'd just like to introduce Irwin, and he will begin to do his presentation on clinical data mining. I think we have a couple of chairs up here, so folks.
Should I do it?
Yeah, go ahead. Irwin?
Thanks. Thank you all for coming. I assume it's not just the free lunch, but it looks really good. And I do want to tell you that if you're here because it says data mining, and you're expecting me to be talking about big data mining, meaning like fancy ways of analyzing enormous data sets, I'm not going to be talking about that. So enjoy your lunch, whatever, but that's not what I'm talking about. And the reason why I call it clinical data mining is because essentially what I'm doing is trying to engage practitioners in reflecting on their own practice by using data that they routinely generate. And I was just telling Michael that one very interesting, and I work in a school of social work, and most of the agencies that I work with are social work agencies or groups of social workers in multidisciplinary settings like hospitals and so on. But one of the most recent projects that I did was a project in Newcastle, Australia, that involved an entire applied sort of an entire health system where instead of just working with social workers, I was using this clinical data mining approach with allied health professionals, which meant physical therapists, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, and so on. And so it was very exciting for me to discover the uses of this approach with practitioners of any kind. And like I didn't even have to know first of all, I didn't even have to know what they were talking about. In other words, the problems they were dealing with or the interventions they were employing. For example, I was working with speech pathologists about something they called thyroid voice and their ability to recognize it from practice wisdom, and also, most importantly, how to judge when in the process of surgery for thyroid problems they should be intervening, they should be assessing patients post-surgery and then intervening. And I knew nothing about the problem itself, but it was very gratifying for me to discover that the process and the approach was very useful to them, and that they learned a great deal, not only about their work, but also about ways of sort of validating what it is they do, and ways of doing it more efficiently and more economically than they were currently doing. Talk about gratifying. It's extremely gratifying for me to be at a place associated with Yuri Bronfenbrenner. And when Michael invited me, I didn't realize that until I got the official invite and saw it. And the reason is, I'm a sociologist as well as a social worker, and I got my PhD in sociology at Columbia in the heyday of sociology, when people like Robert Merton and Paul Lazarsfeld and so on were teaching, and it was a very rarefied atmosphere in which there were courses on the theory of theory, the theory of methodology, the methodology of theory, and so on, and an enormous amount of effort on the part of the faculty was in making the distinction between sociology and other social sciences, and in particular social psychology. And so keeping the levels straight and sort of having us only read pure sociology was very important. And then once in a while, we could read the work of a social psychologist. And Yuri Bronfenbrenner was one of them. And because my orientation is as an applied sociologist, which was certainly not their orientation at the time, they wanted to do anything to separate sociology from social work, applied sociology, and in fact, Paul Lazarsfeld, who was also an applied sociologist, had a different name that he used when he did applied sociology. This is not kidding. So reading Yuri Bronfenbrenner, it was like your parents were dentists and you were allowed candy one day a week, or your first PG movie that your parents took you to. So it was great, and I loved reading his stuff, and so it's a real pleasure to be here. I don't know how to. Okay, so I figured out about 30 minutes to talk about what I have slides that will go on forever about. So, and then leave it open to questions and comments. I do a lot of work at the University of Hong Kong, and there's a graduate student who comes to every one of my lectures, like I'll do it once a year, on clinical data mining, and she'll raise her hand, she'll be the first one, and say, "You're not doing data mining." And finally, I got to the point where I said, "Why do you come? You know that I'm not doing data mining in that sense. Why do you even come to these things?" And she never had an answer for it. So I'm just telling you that I'm not doing big data mining, fuzzy logic. That's not what I'm doing. I'm doing stuff that involves engaging practitioners and doctoral students who are practice-oriented in research that comes out of using available data, and that's one of the connections between Michael and me, is that a lot of the projects that he works on makes, I think, some very effective use of available administrative data. Okay? All right. Now, it also means that when I talk about data mining, I'm also talking about qualitative as well as quantitative data mining. So while most data mining and the idea in people's heads about data mining is that it's purely quantitative, it really doesn't have to be. And I've worked with a few, not many, doctoral students who have done dissertations, essentially qualitative data mining, or mixed method data mining, where some of it is quantitative, some of it is qualitative, and the mix has been extremely rich. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff on here, and it was challenging for me to know, like, whether the audience was going to be essentially social scientists or practitioners or some mix, whatever. are there practitioners here? Are there social work or psych? Oh, so at least one. Welcome. And so because it's often the case. I mean, I consider my practice working with practitioners and blurring the line between practice and research, intentionally doing that, so that people think of research as something that they can do with their own routinely available data, records, process records, whatever, administrative data, and use it to reflect on their practice. And sometimes also use it to promote knowledge in the field. So it's not just the internal sort of formative use of data, but also the summative use of data, the ability to provide knowledge to other people who are interested in similar kinds of problems through publications and so on. Okay. So the inspiration, in a way, for this talk comes from like three different places. And I want to come back. Jane made reference to an article that I wrote, which is really the first article that I wrote about clinical data mining, when I sort of gave a name to what I do. And a number of people have pointed out, well, I'm not the first person to do it, but maybe I'm the first person to call it that. And Jane made reference to this article and how useful it's been. And actually, that was in 2001. And the subtitle of the article was better than the title, which is, the subtitle is Mining for Silver While Dreaming of Gold. And the implication of that metaphor was that clinical data mining studies are practice-based research studies that never achieve the kind of potential for talking about causality that randomized controlled studies, the so-called gold standard research studies, provide. But you can use the logic, you can use the concepts, and maybe there are situations in which you couldn't ethically or feasibly do an RCT, but where clinical data mining might get you as close as possible to do that. Now, I have to say, I've been doing a lot of stuff since 2001, which is why there's all this stuff here. And one of the things that I did, like, since then, is to think, oh, you know, this approach, which started at Mount Sinai Hospital, where I have a joint appointment, and where I work with a lot of health social workers and sometimes multidisciplinary health teams. And in a way, I stumbled into this method with a group of social workers and psychiatrists working in liver transplant. And they had to make some very heavy-duty decisions about who gets a transplant and who doesn't. And they asked me to come in and help them design a study that would help them determine whether the decisions that they made were sound decisions, because they had to turn away like 50% of the applicants, and you know, this could mean death. So the first thing I did, because I was trained as, you know, sort of as a researcher who collects original data, who sees RCTs as the gold standards, and so the first thing I do is talk about that as a possibility, and they were horrified. You know, how could you possibly think of, and in a way, it denied them of their expertise, because not only did it represent an ethical issue, but it also said, well, that's what they're there to decide, like who is clinically most suitable, you know, not from a medical standpoint, but from a psychosocial standpoint, to receiving a scarce resource, a liver, and getting the transplant, and who's going to survive and who isn't, and are they making the right decisions. So I've never had to do this in a half an hour, so it's a real challenge for me. So anyway, I may never get to slide 2. And so what I did was I asked 2 questions, which turned out to be really prophetic, which was, well, how many liver transplants have you done already? And they said, well, we've done about 500. Wow. And I'm thinking a prospective study, how long is it going to be to generate like 500 or 400 cases? And I said, well, and what kind of information do you collect from these patients? And I was amazed because they were doing clinical interviews. They were having people fill out paper and pencil, standardized instruments. They were doing all kinds of stuff, and they even referred to it as the database, but it never occurred to them to use it in aggregate form to study anything other than to use it to make a decision with the team. Does this person get a liver transplant? Does this person not get a liver transplant? Make some kind of judgment that was informed by practice, wisdom, and what they learned, and so on. Okay. So I said, wow, this is an amazing database. And I said, oh, is this computerized? And they said, no, it's in the file cabinet. And in there were these stacks of questionnaires and process records. And I said, this is amazing. And then I said, well, what about, and then I'm thinking about outcomes now. And do you routinely do follow-ups, collect any? No, they had nothing like that. But what they did have are hospital records. Did patients survive the operation? And how long post-transplant they were still around? And I said, fantastic. What about, would you be interested in doing a study with me in which we extract the data from these records and see what happens? And that was the start of this major career change for me, and the fact that every consult that I do, where people call me in to help with evaluation, I start with, what data do you already have? You know, what are you because people don't routinely think about aggregating the data and drawing lessons from it. Or if they do, or the people who do big data stuff, they don't involve the practitioners in it. They just crunch the numbers and bring back some very complicated findings and say, here it is, or what, how do we make sense of this? So that's, now, I was asked I'm going to try to get this slide too. I was asked in June to give a keynote at an international conference on practice research in Helsinki, and the theme of the conference was producing robust knowledge in practice research. And it was interesting because this conference was going on at the same time in Helsinki as the Campbell collaboration was taking place in Copenhagen. And do you all know about the Campbell collaboration? Okay, and they're like heavily invested in RCTs and the knowledge that can be generated and evidence-based interventions, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And so it occurred to me, what do we mean by robust here? And I said, okay, that's the title of my talk. By the way, what do we mean by robust? Because, and I'll show you that the next thing I did was to go to the Campbell collaboration and look at and in a way I was doing data mining. I didn't think of it till now. I was look at the titles of all the presentations and which ones used the word robust in them, and there were a zillion of them. And what do they mean by robust? And the vast majority of cases involved effect size. In other words, is there a good effect size for this intervention? And some of you are nodding your head, so I assume you know what effect size is. It comes out of RCTs and meta-analyses. And so, I know that a lot of the stuff that I do, some does, but most of it doesn't involve looking at effect size. And I said to my audience, well, if you want to know if that's what robust means to you, and you want to know about effect size, you should be in Copenhagen. You shouldn't be in Helsinki listening to me, because what I'm about is, like, what can you learn even if you can't get to the point of really producing some information about effect size of this intervention that's generalizable to multiple settings using the same intervention model faithfully and so on. So, okay. Then, in talking about coming here, I was extremely happy that Michael told me about it. He said, well, of course, you probably know the work of Kasdan, a psychologist who's done stuff that sounds like what you've been doing, because over the 12 years since I wrote that article, Jane, I've been doing a lot of stuff, and it's only recently that, just by chance, that I started working with some PhD students, and one in particular at the University of Hong Kong, who are doing data mining but also looking at effect size. So I've had the opportunity to start thinking about some of the ways in which clinical data mining can contribute to that conversation, but also can go beyond it. Because I think in some respects, one of the problems with RCTs and meta-analyses, and I hope I don't offend you, is that they decontextualize practice. And in fact, that's the intention, is to come up with some universal statement about the power of the intervention, but not to ask what to me seem like more refined questions about who does it work with, who doesn't it work with, under what conditions does it produce a more impressive effect size, under what conditions less. And what that final bullet is about refers to this particular student, Herman Lowe, who did this wonderful dissertation that I wish some of my students at Hunter would do, because it was incredibly ambitious and also sophisticated, about a group cognitive behavior therapy with Hong Kong adults dealing with depression and anxiety. And one of the things that, so if I had more time, I guess what I would be doing is talking about the different clinical data mining dissertations that I've supervised, and not about the effect size issue so much, but about the ways in which they reflect on context. In other words, what surrounds the intervention? What are the characteristics of those who receive the intervention? What are the variations in ways in which the interventions are applied? And then what are the outcomes? And I think in many respects, while clinical data mining cannot provide the ultimate answers about mediators, moderators, different ways in which the intervention is successful or not, but it can offer clues about that. And I think those clues are really exciting. Whether they can be translated into new rounds of RCTs and so on, that's another set of issues. But I think in many respects, so what I started out by talking about the gold standard, I sort of started thinking, maybe this is megalomaniac of me, I don't know what the equivalent, but that in some respects, that what we call gold standard can actually be improved upon by looking at context systematically, and maybe even by using a less than gold standard method for research that would provide clues about contextual factors that importantly affect outcomes. Okay? Now, back to Kasdan, one of the things that I really appreciated about Michael introducing me to his stuff is that he wrote a wonderful article when he was the president of the American Psychological association called Evidence-Based Practice Treatment and Evidence-Based Treatment and Practice: New Opportunities to Bridge Clinical Research and Practice. And in that article, he talks about different strategies for actually moving beyond the RCT. And one of the things he talks about is more qualitative research to contextualize sort of what the intervention, how the intervention is being implemented in what organizational context. Secondly, he talks about giving more attention to moderators, those things that modify the effectiveness of the intervention. And the third thing that he talks about is collecting the experience of practitioners. And I read that and I thought, whoa, that's kind of like what I do. And he's not talking about engaging the practitioners in doing that process of data collection and so on, which is, I think, the way in which I think of clinical data mining, is as much engaging practitioners in studying their own practice with their own data. But obviously, in working with doctoral students, more likely they're working with data that other people have collected. Or that in Herman Lowe's situation, that the agency has routinely collected from every client who has come in for treatment as a mental health agency, for treatment for depression or anxiety. They've made a choice based on a literature review that group CBT is the most effective and also the most efficient, because it's group rather than individual intervention, evidence-based intervention for anxiety and depression. And they've routinely collected all kinds of data about different kinds of, like paper and pencil tests about, personality attributes, also stuff about whether people were currently in individual therapy or not, stuff obviously about demographic characteristics, all kinds of additional, what I would call contextual data, that allowed Herman to not only look at how effective this intervention was. And remember, at that point, we didn't know, and I have copies of that paper here, so if anybody's really interested in looking at that particular study, I'll leave them for you. But he was also able to look at moderators and contextual factors that influence the success, and essentially say, even though he got a really good effect size, and this is another important point, that we had no idea whether group CBT was going to work as well with Hong Kong Chinese adults as it did in all those studies that were done largely in the United States with non-Asian population. And remember, the whole point of the RCT is to universalize it and to say, okay, well, randomly assigned, so it couldn't possibly be background differences that accounted for differences in the effects of this intervention. But because he had data from a sample that was purely Hong Kong Chinese adults, it could be that the effect size, and he was able to measure the effect, it could be that it worked less well, it could be that it worked better. We had no idea. So we were able to compare the effect size he achieved with group CBT, and it was pretty much the same, which was an interesting finding, and it said, okay, culturally, this doesn't seem to have a differential impact. But the fact that it had a good effect size doesn't mean that it works with everybody. And sort of the standard of high effect size is like 0.8, and that still means that maybe close to 40% are not helped by this intervention. And when I've talked to people who are, I've been in a kind of dialogue for the last 15 years or so with the evidence-based practice movement, particularly in the United States, which is why I'm more likely to be invited to Hong Kong than I am today. I'm so happy to be here. I mean, there's no jet lag. I didn't have to, like, my eye drops, nobody looked at them. I just got on the bus. It was fantastic. So, but the point is that a lot of, particularly lay people, don't understand, like, and I mean, for example, agency directors who are choosing an intervention, do not understand that to say this is the most evidence-based intervention, most effective evidence-based intervention for this particular problem that we have, it doesn't mean that it works for everybody. And I remember attending I'm never going to get to anything. It's okay. I attended a presentation at Mount Sinai Hospital where I do a lot of work of an evidence-based practice unit where, so I raised the question, I had a lot of questions about a case example that was provided where essentially what they were doing was looking for a problem that this patient had that lent itself to an evidence-based intervention rather than seeing what problems this person was facing and figuring out what to do about it. And in a way it was I thought it was a tragic, what I would say was a goal displacement, where the means become the ends in themselves. And I said to him, well, what if it doesn't work? What if this evidence-based intervention doesn't work? And his response was, well, with every intervention model, some patients crash and burn anyway, and we just have to accept it. And I found that unacceptable. And what I'm trying to do is argue for the way in which, and I use the term evidence-informed practice, where I'm saying there are different models, there are different ways of doing research, there are different ways of reflecting on what is going on in practice. I don't believe in sort of mindlessly saying, well, I do this model of intervention because I like it the most. It's most compatible with my personal orientation. I think the research is really important. I think reflection is really important. I think practice wisdom is important. And I think most important is engaging practitioners in a systematic process of looking at their own practice. Okay? And one of the wonderful things about Herman's dissertation is that, and it's quite interesting, is that not only did he do this clinical data mining study with over 800 patients, because they had this, in this agency, the data were all computerized, but they also had all these personality variables where they were able to say, okay, what are the personality qualities of people with whom this intervention works and does not work? And so, for example, he found that patients, that clients who scored high on rigid personality did best with group CBT. And clients who had a much more kind of flexible way of seeing the world, a much more sort of existential, philosophical way of seeing the world, who didn't follow directions, essentially, did not do especially well. And one of the things that I really admired him so much for is that he went on, not like, for me it would have been fine to just leave it at that clinical data mining place because we learned a lot. We also learned that clients who were concurrently in individual therapy did better than clients who were only doing group CBT. We also learned that clients with a high energy level, that, all kinds of things we didn't expect. We didn't have hypotheses driving this, but we had all the data, and all the data were computerized, and just by having an analytic model rather than a theory, we were able to find out some very interesting and important things. But what Herman did was to go on from there to do an RCT. And he did an RCT with a mindfulness intervention on the assumption that some kinds of people do better with a mindfulness intervention than with group CBT. Okay? And so, obviously, this was a study in which both the student and the program in which he was in valued methodological pluralism, valued mixed method, and the ways in which, mixed method has become kind of fashionable. And I know I have a lot of doctoral students who say, oh, they want to do a mixed method study. But which comes first? How do they relate to each other? And so on. This is something people haven't even thought about. It's just like, wouldn't it be cool to do a qualitative and a quantitative study? Well, yeah, but you got to go beyond that to say, how are each of these going to contribute to answering the questions you're interested in? How are you going to relate them to each other? And so on. So I really admired the way in which, the seriousness with which Herman went about this task. Okay. So what do I do now? Oh, okay. So I have this PowerPoint, and a couple of weeks ago, somebody told me that one of her students said, PowerPoint is so yesterday. And so I'm even hesitant to, and I don't know what's today, but here I am. And so, the way this talk is organized, or this PowerPoint is organized, is to talk about essentially the place of clinical data mining, at least the way I see it, in the evidence-based practice movement and in evidence-informed practice. And it's organized by, first, a set of different doctoral dissertations that use clinical data mining, either by themselves or in concert with other methods. And the whole point of it is to demonstrate how these studies can contribute to an understanding of context. And this is why, again, why Kasdan is so relevant. And remember, I was told never to read psychologists, so that's why it took Michael to. So that's why, yeah. So I was really grateful to find that article, which really paralleled a lot of what it is that I've been doing for the last 15 years or so, and it's always nice to find validation. The other set of studies are studies like the liver transplant study, which are done by practitioners, so that you know that this is a model that could be extremely useful for engaging practitioners, usually as a group rather than as individuals. And it could be a group of, a team of social workers, but it could be a multidisciplinary team in analyzing their own data and in making relevant program and practice inferences from it. Okay, and I just want to also underscore that one of the the lesson of all of this is contextualize, but not too much, because I'm also mindful of the way in which some of my students who do purely qualitative dissertations are so involved in the contextualization process that the focus is so unique to that particular situation that the question of generalization, even of generalizing, not finding so much, but ideas for future research, sort of get lost in the emphasis on the uniqueness of the situation that's being studied. And I have to say, on my way up here on the bus, and just from the standpoint of methodological pluralism, I'm working with a doctoral student now who's doing autoethnography, which I had never heard of before. And it's a study in which it's qualitative, obviously, in which the N is 1 and the subject is the student. And he is talking about, he's a transgendered person, and he is talking about what it means to go through this process. And how does one, and the title of it is taken from Goffman in a way, negotiate, something like the presentation of trans in everyday life. Now the challenge in this study, so this is entirely original, it's like I'm learning about this methodology now, but the challenge is what is generalizable from this N of 1 study, and how does it differ from just telling the story of his life? And so the issue of and I talk in this about the nomothetic fallacy, which is overgeneralization, which is stripping context, and the ideographic fallacy, which is focusing on the immediate, the unique, to such an extent that you can't do anything with it. And basically what I'm doing is arguing for a middle road between the two and a methodologically pluralist approach. I'm going to stop there and respond to questions or comments. But if you say, but you're not talking about data mining, I'm going to say, oh, well, why'd you come? Yeah. Oh, in the hall, right.
You really are a student of Robert Merton, by the way.
Absolutely. Well, why do you say that?
Well, you just finished with theories of the middle range.
I am a middle. We used to refer to him as the middle ranger.
And you also slipped in the goal displacement just on the side.
Oh, you got that too. Thank you.
I'm the only one in the room who's old.
Thank you very much. But did you know that Paul Lazarsfeld had a pseudonym for his applied research? I don't know what it was, but he did a lot of work, market research, but he didn't like it as associated with his name. So because he was, a theorist of methodology. So there you go. All right. Thank you for that. Yes.
I'm old enough too to have been acquainted with Lazarsfeld in his communication theory work. And I don't know if it was him or some of the other theorists at the time, but individual differences was one of the principles of persuasive communication, which I'm interested in how that links to your thoughts about individual differences, that not everything works with the same,
I'm trying to link it to the communication.
Not everybody, any receiver responds. Different receivers respond differently to the same message, and a receiver will respond differently to different messages.
Right, and one of my first associations with your question is, I also have to say that from the standpoint of engaging practitioners in research, this doesn't work with everybody. So, I have found it, there's a lot of stuff written about how social work practitioners hate research, don't want to be involved in it, and so on. And there have been, I think, adjustments to pedagogy that are sort of unfortunate. That's associated with the evidence-based practice movement. I won't go into that. But it should be clear that I'm not saying this is a panacea for that problem, and clinical data mining is a panacea. It is, however, a remarkably effective way of engaging people who don't think of themselves as researchers in a research process which they find enjoyable, and where they're working as a team. And I've worked with teams where individuals have left the agency but are still coming back to work with a team because they're really interested in what the findings are. Moreover, some critics of it have said, well, practitioners are not, they're only going to, when they're doing data extraction, they're going to do it in a way that makes them look good. And you can't really trust the quality of the data and there are things we do. I said we use research principles, so we do stuff about reliability and validity and so on. But I've been very impressed with at least those people that get engaged in the process with their willingness to discover things that aren't so happy and to do something about it. And part of it is because I don't go into it denigrating what they do. So often I'll be asking people, the first set of questions has to do with, well, what are you trying to achieve here? And what interventions are you using? And so on. And it's a very hard thing. I mean, we talk about goal displacement. It's a very hard thing for people to specify in measurable terms what they do as practitioners, but I don't give them grief for it. You know, essentially what I'm doing is saying, yeah, I understand it. Let's stay with that, and let's keep talking about it until we have an understanding of what it is they're trying to accomplish and what does a successful outcome look like to you? How do you know you're doing a good job with a client or a patient? What does that look like? And so on. But thank you for your question. Other questions? Yes.
So you can envision two different kind of philosophies about how to improve practice. Lots of different ones, but two dominant ones maybe. One is kind of the centralized top-down approach, which is, make large investments in a scientific process where we, develop intervention models based on visiting research and then test them in RCTs and then test whether or not the effects that you got in the RCTs generalized to a typical practice setting. How does it work when you scale it up? That kind of, trajectory. And obviously there's a lot of promise there, but there's probably a lot of problems because it constrains what people do, and it doesn't feel right to people who are on the ground to kind of be boxed in to do those kind of things. Right. So another approach is like do what you're doing on a very large scale, and just instead of having 50 great models that everybody's using, or maybe even 100, get everybody to be these kind of introspective learning units, learning organizations, every clinic, every practitioner, collecting data, looking at what they do, increase their skill of being able to get good measures and use good decision rules on, like, how do I know if it's really working? Right. You know what I mean? Because there's a lot of things that the scientific community has learned in doing this research. Like, you can see a huge improvement or a huge decline in people's functioning. Sometimes that's regression to the mean. Oh, well, that's good for us to try to use some methods to minimize so we don't fool ourselves. Or it's a case mix issue. We happened this year just to get a whole bunch of really bad kids, and it looks like we did a terrible job, but in fact, if we accounted for all that stuff. Right. And
if you studied those very internal variations, you might know more about it rather than just saying, oh, it's probably someone. But
So do you have a position on that? I would respect a position that says, let's reinvest. Let's reinvest our scientific dollars to build the scientific capacity of all these practitioner units all around the country. Maybe we'd end up, it's like a wiki approach, maybe they'd end up with better information.
Yes, and I was at a conference in Houston a couple of weeks ago where, and see the title of Kasdan's Opportunities to Bridge, this conference was about bridging research and practice. And what I was saying, and if I went into Kasdan's article and a number of other, I found this metaphor used in a number of other recent presentations by people in different professions. It was the bridge versus the pipeline. And the first model you gave, I would say, is really a pipeline model. And I said, and so I gave a presentation at this conference that was in which the title was something like Building a Bridge or Digging a Pipeline. And I was extremely critical about the way in which the evidence-based practice movement in this country was very much the pipeline approach. Translational science, blah, blah, it's all one direction. And what I'm saying is it's not a matter of one versus the other, but maybe there's a middle way in which each can contribute. The RCTs, the meta-analyses, but also other, some would say lesser forms of research or less goals, including data mining, but others as well. So, but one of the things I learned at this conference was that some people are using the word purveyors. There are people, there are organizations that are, and some for profit and some not, that are promoting the model of intervention and just assuming that all you have to do is do it faithfully with fidelity and the outcomes will happen. You know, it's sort of like build it and they will come. And so, and we don't even have to study it anymore, that because the prior evidence is so, presumably so convincing, that all we have to do is get people to do this. And so they manualize the interventions and so on. Now, I know I've done lots of workshops where practitioners complain about, they're really resentful about the manualization, about the way in which it doesn't leave opportunities to do creative work around it. And my evidence-based practice colleagues would say, oh, that's not true at all. These are not cookbooks. People have, flexibility, blah, blah, blah. But I hear what practitioners have to say. So I gave this presentation in North Carolina, and in Houston. And on the panel were all these heavy-duty evidence-based practices: Eileen Gambrill, Bruce Thayer, Alan Rubin. And they were like, they couldn't wait to get out of the cage because they said that I was misrepresenting their movement, I was misrepresenting the field, that what I was saying was a total distortion, so on, and I refer to it as a geriatric smackdown. It was brutal. It was really brutal, and I was the only one on that side of the river, and there's a lot that, anyway, some good things came out of it, one of which, and I think I can go public on this, some I can't, but one was Bruce Thayer, who is the champion of evidence-based practice, wrote to me before the conference, because he had read my paper, which was sort of risky on my part to give these guys the opportunity to see what I was going to say. And he asked me a couple of questions, and he said, I did this study some years ago, and is this what you would call clinical data mining? And it was. So at this conference, to his credit, he said that the most cited article that he has ever published was that article, which was really a clinical data miner. And I really appreciate it, and I thank him for it. So, I think there's room for all of us. But I also think that, and if you look at this, you'll see I have, instead of that pyramid, the hierarchy of evidence that evidence-based practice people, I talk about a wheel of evidence in which we're sort of recognizing the contribution that different kinds of research can make, and also the limitations of each kind. And what are called gold standard studies have serious limitations, and I think it's about time we just sort of acknowledge that and recognize how each different methodological approach makes a different contribution, and we're all in it for the same reason. We're in it to do, it's not like, big business, the big farm's use of data mining. We're doing it for good social reasons, and we're in it together, and let's stop calling each other names and embrace all the different approaches. I think I'm over time, so thank you.
Irwin will be here afterwards. Clinical Data Mining is a terrific book, but this one here, Clinical Data Mining in Allied Health Organizations, actually gives you examples of it, and both of these are at the Cornell Library, and you can pick them up on Amazon. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.